April 25, 1945. On the shattered banks of the Elbe River, near the German town of Torgau, two worlds collide. Not in violence, but in a jubilant, chaotic embrace. On one side, the soldiers of the American First Army. On the other, troops of the Soviet 58th Guards Rifle Division. They are young, they are exhausted, and they are victorious. They slap each other on the back, they exchange souvenirs, stars for buttons, dollars for rubles. They share cigarettes and toast with whatever potent liquid they can find. Look at their faces. Pure, unadulterated relief. The war in Europe, the most catastrophic conflict in human history, is finally, mercifully, coming to an end. For a fleeting moment, under a pale spring sky, these men are not capitalists or communists. They are not representatives of opposing ideologies. They are simply allies, brothers in arms, who have crushed a common, monstrous enemy. The famous photo of Second Lieutenant William Robertson and Lieutenant Alexander Silvashko, hands clasped, beaming at the camera, became a symbol of this moment. A symbol of hope. A promise of a new world, built on the foundations of this shared victory. But a photograph, even one so powerful, only captures a fraction of a second. It doesn't capture the years of suspicion that came before, or the decades of bitter animosity that would follow. It doesn't tell you what was really going through the mind of that Soviet soldier, Alexander, as he shook the hand of the American, William. What did he truly think of this man from a world away? A man from a country his own government had, for years, painted as a den of decadent, exploitative monsters. Was this smile just for the cameras? Was it just the euphoria of survival? Or was there something more? To answer that question, we have to journey back through the blood and ice of the Eastern Front, through the smoke-filled halls of the Kremlin, and into the homes, the factories, and the hearts of the ordinary Soviet people. We need to peel back layers of propaganda, fear, and hope to understand what they actually thought about Americans during the Second World War. And what you'll find is not a simple story of black and white, of love or hate. It's a complex, contradictory, and deeply human tapestry of admiration and suspicion, of immense gratitude and profound frustration. This is the story of the strange, forgotten alliance between two future enemies, seen through the eyes of the people who lived it. Before the storm of war broke, the image of America in the Soviet Union was a carefully constructed paradox. On one hand, there was the official, omnipresent voice of the state. This was the America of propaganda. From the moment a Soviet child entered school, they were taught a specific catechism. The world was divided into two camps: the righteous, progressive world of socialism, led by the benevolent comrade Stalin, and the decaying, corrupt world of capitalism. And the undisputed king of that capitalist world, the final boss in this global morality play, was the United States of America. Newspapers like Pravda and Izvestia were filled with stories that confirmed this narrative. They spoke of the millions unemployed during the Great Depression, of hungry farmers driven from their land, of the brutal exploitation of the working class by soulless factory owners. They hammered home the theme of racial injustice, with the case of the Scottsboro Boys, 9 black teenagers falsely accused of rape in Alabama, becoming a cause célèbre in the USSR, presented as definitive proof of America's inherent barbarism. Soviet political cartoons were a masterclass in this form of character assassination. The American capitalist was always the same. A grotesque figure, obese and porcine, wearing a top hat and a suit made of dollar bills, a cigar clenched in his teeth, his spidery fingers reaching across the globe to strangle the world's workers. America was Wall Street. It was a land where the rich danced on the graves of the poor, where justice was for sale, and where the promise of freedom was a cruel joke. For the ideologically pure party member, for the dedicated Komsomol youth, This was not just a caricature, it was the fundamental truth of the world. America was the enemy, the antithesis of everything the Soviet Union was striving to be. But there was another America, a phantom America that slipped through the cracks of the ideological wall. It was an America that wasn't spoken of in political meetings, but whispered about in factory smoke breaks and dreamed about in the flickering darkness of a cinema hall. This was the America of technology, of scale, of seemingly magical efficiency. You see, in the 1930s, the Soviet Union was in a desperate, frantic race to industrialize. Stalin's 5-year plans were designed to drag a vast agrarian nation into the 20th century by its bootstraps. And the model for this monumental effort, the secret blueprint for progress, was American. Soviet engineers and delegations flocked to the United States. They visited the steel mills of Gary, Indiana, and the assembly lines of Detroit. They studied the construction of the Empire State Building and the operations of General Electric. The legendary Ford River Rouge complex was, for them, a kind of industrial mecca. They brought back not just blueprints and machinery, but stories of a land where things worked on a scale that was simply unimaginable. The name Ford became almost a holy word in the Soviet lexicon. The first mass-produced Soviet tractor, the Fordson Pudolovets, was a copy of a Fordson. The first Soviet mass-produced passenger car, the Gaz-A, was a licensed copy of the Ford Model A. Thousands of American engineers and skilled workers, some fleeing the Depression, others driven by socialist ideals, came to the USSR to help build these new industrial giants, like the Magnitogorsk Steel Complex, a city willed into existence in the Ural Mountains, modeled directly on its American counterparts. So, for the average Soviet worker or engineer, America was this strange dual entity. In the newspaper, it was a hellscape of oppression. But the lathe he was operating might have been built in Cincinnati. The tractor tilling the fields of the collective farm, the kolkhoz, was a descendant of a machine from Dearborn. The very idea of the assembly line, the conveyor, which was changing the face of Soviet industry, was an American import. This admiration for American know-how, for their delovitost, a hard-to-translate word meaning business-like pragmatism and efficiency, was immense. It was a grudging respect. They could build things. They could organize things. They were practical. While Soviet propaganda celebrated heroic, chaotic, often inefficient bursts of human labor, the American method seemed cooler, more rational, almost superhuman. And then there was the America of culture, of dreams. Hollywood films, carefully selected and sometimes censored, were incredibly popular. The comedies of Charlie Chaplin and Harold Lloyd, the adventures of Douglas Fairbanks. But perhaps no star shone brighter than Deanna Durbin. Her musical comedies, like 100 Men and a Girl, presented a vision of America that was completely alien to a Soviet citizen. A world of spacious apartments, beautiful clothes, endless food, and effortless optimism, where problems could be solved with a catchy song. It was pure fantasy, a glimpse into a life of impossible glamour and ease. Even the slang reflected this duality. An Amerikanka became the popular name for a type of windbreaker jacket seen as stylish and practical. Jazz, officially condemned as decadent music of the fat cats, was wildly popular in underground circles. So, on the eve of the war, the Soviet mind held two Americas. One was a political monster. The other was a technological and cultural powerhouse. One was to be loathed, the other to be secretly admired and emulated. It was a nation of cruel bosses and brilliant engineers, of lynch mobs and smiling movie stars. It was a contradiction. And then, in the pre-dawn hours of June 22, 1941, that contradiction was rendered meaningless. Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft smashed across the Soviet border. It was the largest invasion in human history, and it was an almost unimaginable catastrophe. The Red Army, hobbled by Stalin's recent purges of its officer corps and caught completely by surprise, seemed to melt away. Entire armies were encircled and annihilated. Within weeks, the Germans were deep into Soviet territory, driving towards Leningrad, Kiev, and the ultimate prize, Moscow. The shock was total. The carefully constructed world of Soviet propaganda, a world of invincible socialist might, shattered in an instant. The radio broadcast by Foreign Minister Molotov, his voice trembling, announced the betrayal. Citizens of the Soviet Union, without any declaration of war, German forces have attacked our country. In those first weeks and months, survival was the only ideology. The old enmities, the carefully taught hatreds, they suddenly seemed like luxuries from another lifetime. As Soviet soldiers died in the hundreds of thousands, as civilians starved, as the nation teetered on the very brink of collapse, a single desperate question began to form in the collective consciousness. Are we alone in this? When Winston Churchill, the arch anti-communist, announced that Britain would aid the Soviet Union, it was a shock. But Britain was already fighting for its life. The real question, the one whispered in breadlines and military headquarters, was about that other, more distant power. What would America do? What would Roosevelt do? Would the world's greatest capitalist power, the ideological arch-nemesis, really help save the world's only communist state? The skepticism was profound. Many ordinary people, and even those high up in the party, believed the Western powers would be happy to just sit back and watch Germany and the Soviet Union bleed each other white. It was the logical conclusion of years of mutual suspicion. And then the news began to trickle in. America was extending aid. President Roosevelt spoke of supporting the Russian people. In October 1941, the first Anglo-American Soviet conference was held in Moscow. And in November, Roosevelt formally approved the extension of Lend Lease aid to the USSR. A lifeline had been thrown. But what did this mean in reality? To a soldier freezing in a trench outside Moscow? To a woman working 16-hour shifts in a factory relocated to the Urals, these high-level political agreements were just words. The help wasn't real until you could see it, touch it, taste it. The true story of what Soviets thought about Americans during the war is the story of the arrival of that help. It's the story of Lend Lease. Lend Lease. For most Americans today, it's a dusty term from a history textbook, a program that sent supplies to allies. But for the Soviet people who lived through the war, Lend Lease was not an abstract policy. It was a physical reality that, in many cases, meant the difference between life and death, victory and defeat. And it profoundly and permanently shaped their view of America. Let's start with the most basic human need, food. The German invasion had overrun the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, Ukraine. Famine was not a threat, it was a reality. The state-issued bread ration was barely enough to sustain life. And into this world of desperate hunger came a miracle in a can. We called it the Second Front, a veteran might recall, because the first cans started arriving long before the actual Second Front in Normandy. It was this American canned meat, tushonka. Not like ours. Ours was mostly fat and gristle. This was real meat. Sometimes pork, sometimes beef. We would open a can, heat it over a little fire. The smell, you cannot imagine. For a soldier who had been living on black bread and thin cabbage soup, it was a feast. We would also get egg powder. You just add water, and suddenly you have scrambled eggs. It felt like magic, American magic. This wasn't just a luxury for the front lines. Canned meat, Spam, powdered eggs, dried milk, and flour from America and Britain supplemented the starvation rations of civilians in the rear, especially in the northern ports of Murmansk and Archangel, where the Arctic convoys arrived.
A child who received a piece of American chocolate for the first time would remember that taste for the rest of their life. It wasn't just food, it was a taste of another world. A world where food wasn't a desperate daily struggle. The quality itself was a revelation. The packaging was sturdy, clean, and efficient. The instructions were clear. It spoke of a system, a culture of abundance and care that was utterly alien. Each can of Spam was a small, greasy, and incredibly powerful pro-American propaganda. It didn't need a political commissar to explain it. You could taste the explanation. It said, "The Americans are our allies, and their country is unbelievably rich." Then there were the machines, the sinews of war. The Soviet Union produced vast quantities of weapons, particularly tanks like the legendary T-34, and artillery. Their designs were often brilliant, rugged, and perfectly suited for the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. But the war machine needed more than just tanks. It needed to move. It needed logistics. And this is where America's contribution became legendary. Two words became burned into the memory of every Soviet soldier: Studer and Willis. Studer was the universal soldier's slang for the Studebaker US-6 truck. Over 150,000 of these magnificent machines were sent to the Soviet Union. To the soldiers, they seemed like a gift from the gods of engineering. They were powerful, they were reliable, and crucially, they had all-wheel drive. While Soviet gas trucks would get hopelessly stuck in the ubiquitous mud, the Rasputitsa, the Studebakers would just keep going. They became the backbone of the Red Army's supply lines. They carried ammunition, food, and soldiers to the front. They towed artillery guns. The famous Katyusha rocket launchers, the Stalin's organs, were often mounted on Studebaker chassis, giving them the mobility they needed to be so devastatingly effective. A Soviet driver, used to his own fragile, underpowered trucks that required constant tinkering, would look upon his Studer with a mixture of awe and affection. The comfortable cabin, the clear gauges, the powerful engine that started in the bitter cold. Everything about it spoke of quality. It was a machine built to work, not just to meet a production quota. Drivers would lovingly care for their Studebakers, often treating them better than they treated themselves. To have a Studer was to be a king of the road. And then there was the Willis MB Jeep. Small, nimble, and unbelievably tough, it could go almost anywhere. It became the signature vehicle of Red Army commanders. To see a Willis bouncing across a battlefield was to see a sign of authority. It was fast, it was modern, it was agile. Like the Studebaker, it was a symbol of a different kind of industrial power, one based not just on brute force, but on smart design and high-quality manufacturing. The sky, too, was filled with American technology. While the Red Air Force's workhorses were Soviet-made fighters like the Yak and Lavochkin, a significant portion of its fighter fleet was American. The Bell P-39 Airacobra, in particular, was surprisingly beloved by Soviet pilots, even though it had been rejected by American and British aviators. Its powerful nose-mounted 37mm cannon was perfect for the low-altitude, ground attack role common on the Eastern Front. The Soviets called it the Kobruka, or Cobra, and some of their greatest aces, like Alexander Pokroshkin, scored the majority of their victories flying it. They loved its firepower and its ruggedness. They received over 5,000 of them, along with thousands of other aircraft like the P-63 King Cobra and the A-20 Boston Bomber. For a Soviet pilot or mechanic, working on an American plane was another revelation. The precision of the parts, the quality of the wiring, the logic of the layout.
They also received high-octane aviation fuel from the West, which allowed their own Soviet-designed engines to perform at a higher level. Beyond the big-ticket items, Lend-Lease permeated every aspect of the war effort. American aluminum was crucial for building Soviet aircraft. American explosives were packed into Soviet shells. Soviet soldiers marched in American-made boots, the quality of which was legendary among men used to flimsy footwear that fell apart in weeks. The radios that allowed tank commanders to coordinate their attacks for the first time were often American. Entire factories, telephone wire, railway cars, locomotives, the list is almost endless. The sheer scale and quality of this aid created a powerful undercurrent of gratitude and admiration. It was concrete, it was saving lives, it was helping to kill Germans. On a personal level, for the soldier at the front, the American who sent the Tuchanka, the boots, and the Studer was a true ally, a friend. But this gratitude was tangled up with a more complex and far more painful emotion. For 3 long, agonizing years, as the Soviet Union bore the overwhelming brunt of the Nazi war machine, one phrase was on everyone's lips. It was a plea, a demand, a prayer, and a curse: the Second Front. For an American in 1942 or 1943, the war was happening in the Pacific, in North Africa, in the skies over Germany. It was real, and it was deadly. But for a Soviet citizen, the war was total. It was happening everywhere, all the time. It was a meat grinder that consumed human beings on an industrial scale. From June 1941 until June 1944, for 3 full years, the vast majority of the German army was fighting and dying on the Eastern Front. The numbers are so large they become almost meaningless, but we must try to grasp them.
We're talking about millions of men locked in a death struggle along a front that stretched for over 1,000 miles. The battles of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk were some of the largest and bloodiest military engagements in all of history. Soviet casualties were counted not in the thousands, but in the hundreds of thousands, and often in the millions. Every family had lost someone: a father, a son, a brother. The notices of killed in action or missing were a constant, devastating rain. And in the midst of this national bloodletting, the Soviet people looked to their allies in the West, Britain and America, and asked one question: when are you going to land in France? When are you going to open a real second front to take the pressure off of us? The demand for a second front became a national obsession. It was the subject of official government pronouncements, but more importantly, it was the subject of whispers in every home, every factory, every trench. The Soviet propaganda machine, which had pivoted to promoting the alliance, now walked a tightrope.
It celebrated the Allied bombing raids on Germany and the fighting in North Africa, but it couldn't hide the central fact: the overwhelming burden of the land war in Europe was being carried by the Red Army alone. 1942 came and went, the year of the desperate defense of Stalingrad. The Allies landed in North Africa, a move dismissed by many Soviets as a sideshow. "They are fighting a few German divisions, we are fighting 200, was a common bitter sentiment. The official slogan was Soyuzniki, allies. But the unofficial, cynical joke was that the British would fight to the last Russian soldier. 1943. The tide had turned at Stalingrad, and the colossal tank battle at Kursk broke the back of the German offensive capability. The Red Army was now on the attack, pushing the Germans westward. But the cost was sickening. Every mile regained was paid for with rivers of blood. And still, no second front in France. The Allies landed in Italy, which, again from the Soviet perspective, seemed like a peripheral effort. This delay bred a deep and corrosive suspicion. The official gratitude for Lend-Lease was real, but it was increasingly paired with a feeling of being used. A dark thought began to take root encouraged by subtle hints in the party-controlled press. Are the Americans and British deliberately letting us and the Germans destroy each other? Are they waiting until we are both exhausted so they can sweep in at the end and dictate the peace? For the average person, it wasn't about grand strategy. It was about their loved ones. A woman whose 18-year-old son had just been called up to the front might be grateful for the American flour in her bread, but she would also think, if the Americans landed in France, maybe my boy wouldn't have to go. Maybe this would all be over sooner. The frustration was immense. It was a wound that Lend Lease, for all its benefits, could not heal. The stutter trucks were great, but they weren't a substitute for 1 million American soldiers storming the beaches of Normandy. So when the news of D-Day finally came on June 6, 1944, the reaction in the Soviet Union was complex. There was, of course, immense relief. Finally! The propaganda machine went into overdrive, celebrating the heroic landing as a great triumph of the Allied coalition. And for many, the joy was genuine. The end of the war was now visibly, tangibly closer. But underneath the official jubilation, there was also a sense of, it's about time. There was a lingering bitterness, a feeling that the landing had come too late for millions of Soviet dead. The narrative had already been set in the minds of many. We broke the back of the Wehrmacht ourselves. The Allies arrived to help finish the job. This feeling, this gratitude with an asterisk, is crucial to understanding the Soviet mindset. Yes, thank you for the help, but where were you in 42? Where were you in 43? This question would linger long after the war was over, and it would become a central pillar of the Cold War narrative that the West had not pulled its weight. But the war wasn't just fought with tanks and speeches. It was also fought by people. And as the war progressed, a small but significant number of Soviets got to see their mysterious allies up close, creating another, more personal layer to their perception of Americans. In the summer of 1944, something extraordinary happened. As part of a program codenamed Operation Frantic, American B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, after dropping their payloads on targets in eastern Germany, did not turn back to their bases in Britain or Italy. Instead, they flew on, landing deep inside the Soviet Union at air bases around the Ukrainian city of Poltava. Here, they would rearm and refuel, and then hit another target on their way back west. For the Soviet personnel on these bases, mechanics, ground crew, anti-aircraft gunners, translators, cooks, many of them young women, it was as if aliens had landed. Suddenly, hundreds of actual living, breathing Americans were in their midst. And they were nothing like the grim-faced capitalists of propaganda or the distant, godlike benefactors of Lend Lease. The first impression was one of astonishing casualness. The American airmen seemed impossibly relaxed. They slouched, they put their feet up, they called their officers by their first names. To the Soviets, raised in a culture of rigid military hierarchy and formality, this was mind-boggling. It seemed like a total breakdown of discipline, yet somehow these impossibly casual men flew the most sophisticated bombers in the world with lethal efficiency. Then there was their wealth. It wasn't just that they had money, it was the sheer amount of stuff they had. They had endless supplies of cigarettes, Lucky Strikes and Camels, which they handed out freely. They had chewing gum, a substance most Soviets had never seen before. They had chocolate bars, Zippo lighters, fountain pens, and colorful magazines. They had photographs of their girlfriends, their cars, and their neat suburban houses, images that looked like they were straight out of a Deanna Durbin movie. The Americans were friendly, open, and loud. They smiled easily. They loved to trade, and they were fascinated by Soviet life. They were also enormous, or so it seemed to the Soviets, most of whom were lean from years of wartime rations. The well-fed Americans seemed like giants. The Soviet personnel assigned to work with them looked on with a mixture of fascination, envy, and bewilderment. A young female translator, in her memoirs, might recall being shocked when an American pilot casually asked her out for a walk. Such directness was unheard of. The interactions were a constant source of cultural misunderstanding and amusement. The Americans couldn't understand the pervasive presence of the NKVD, the secret police, who monitored every conversation. The Soviets couldn't understand how the Americans could complain about the food when there was so much of it compared to their own rations. For these Soviets at Poltava, America was no longer an idea. It was Lieutenant Bill from Ohio, who chewed gum and showed you a picture of his sweetheart. It was Sergeant Smith from Texas, who taught you how to jitterbug to the music from his portable radio. They were generous, a little naive, and possessed a confidence that seemed to come from a different planet. They were likable, dangerously so. The authorities were deeply worried about this ideological contamination, and contact was strictly controlled. But you couldn't control curiosity. You couldn't control human connection. This direct contact was rare, limited to a few thousand people. For most, the image of the American ally was still filtered through official channels. Newsreels showed smiling GIs liberating French towns. They showed Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin sitting together at Yalta, the Big Three, charting the course of the post-war world. The message was one of unified strength. The America of Hollywood also continued its cultural assault. Captured German film stocks yielded a trove of American movies, which were shown to soldiers and civilians alike. Films like Sun Valley Serenade were phenomenally popular, presenting a glittering, carefree world of ski resorts, big bands, and romance that served as the perfect antidote to the grim reality of war. For 90 minutes, you could forget the destruction and lose yourself in a fantasy. And that fantasy was America. So as the Red Army pushed its way across Eastern Europe, driving towards Berlin, the Soviet idea of the American ally was a collage of powerful, often conflicting images. It was the can of life-saving Tushonka. It was the eternally reliable Studebaker. It was the frustratingly absent Second Front. It was the smiling, gum-chewing pilot at Poltava. It was Glenn Miller's orchestra swinging through a captured newsreel. It was a nation of brilliant builders and inexplicably slow invaders. A nation of generous friends and calculating partners. It was this complex bundle of thoughts and feelings that a Soviet soldier carried in his head as he fought his way to the heart of Germany. And it was this soldier who, one day in late April 1945, looked up and saw an American patrol on the other side of a broken bridge. Let's go back to that bridge over the Elbe. Let's look again into the eyes of Lieutenant Alexander Silvashko as he shakes the hand of Lieutenant William Robertson. What is he thinking now? He is thinking, first and foremost, we survived. The sheer, overwhelming physical relief of knowing that the war, his war, is over. The killing has stopped. This smiling American is the living proof of that. He is the bookend to 4 years of unimaginable horror. The joy you see in these pictures is absolutely real. It's the joy of men who have walked through hell and come out the other side. He is also thinking with immense curiosity. So this is what they look like. This is an American. For years, they were a myth, a concept. They were a name on a crate of ammunition, a voice on the radio, a character in a film. Now, here one is. He looks like a soldier. Tired, dirty, but alive. He doesn't look like a fat capitalist from a cartoon. He doesn't look like a movie star. He looks like a man who has also seen too much fighting. In that moment, the shared experience of being a combat soldier transcends all politics. They trade souvenirs, a red star emblem for an American flag patch, a Soviet medal for a Zippo lighter. They are trying to grab a physical piece of this historic, impossible moment. He is almost certainly feeling a sense of gratitude. As he looks at the American, he might be thinking of the Studebaker that carried his unit to the front. He might be thinking of the American radio that allowed his commander to call in artillery. He might even be thinking of the P-39 Airacobras that strafed the German positions ahead of his advance. The help was real, and here was its human face. But intertwined with all of this, there might be a flicker of something else, a hint of prideful rivalry. We made it here from Stalingrad, he might think. You made it here from Normandy. We took Berlin, you took somewhere else. There is an unspoken but deeply felt sense that the Soviet victory was harder won. That their path to this river was longer and paved with more of their dead. It's not a hostile thought, not in this moment of celebration, but it's there, a quiet assertion of their own sacrifice. And the officers, the political commissars watching from the sidelines, they are thinking of the future. This is a wonderful photo opportunity, a symbol of Allied unity. But they know the alliance was one of convenience. They know that the ideological chasm is vast. The handshakes are for today. The plans for tomorrow are very different. For a few days, a few weeks, this spirit of the Elbestimmung, flourishes. Soviet and American troops mingle. They drink together, they eat together, they try to communicate with broken German and sign language. They find a common humanity. They discover that the young man from Iowa and the young man from Ivanovo can laugh at the same jokes, and that both of them just want to go home. But it was a fleeting spring. The warmth of the Elbe would be quickly chilled by the icy winds of the Cold War. The shift was breathtakingly fast. The ally of yesterday became the mortal enemy of tomorrow.
Almost as soon as the victory parades were over, the narrative began to change. Stalin, in a famous speech in February 1946, declared that the conflict between communism and capitalism was inevitable. The alliance was officially over. The American image was swiftly and ruthlessly re-edited. The official story of the war was rewritten. The role of Lend-Lease was systematically downplayed, minimized, and eventually almost entirely erased from official histories. The new line was that it had been insignificant, less than 4% of Soviet domestic production. The Studebakers that had carried the Red Army to victory were now just trucks. The Airacobras that Soviet aces had flown were forgotten. The Tushanka that had saved soldiers from starvation was a footnote. Admitting the scale of American help would be admitting a moment of Soviet weakness, a dependence on the new enemy. And that was intolerable. The Second Front narrative was hardened into dogma. The West had deliberately delayed the invasion of France to weaken the USSR. It wasn't a suspicion anymore, it was presented as historical fact. Contact with foreigners, once a sign of alliance, became a mark of treason.
The campaign against cosmopolitanism was launched, a thinly veiled anti-Semitic and anti-Western purge. Anyone who had shown too much friendliness to the Americans at Poltava, anyone who praised American technology too loudly, anyone who loved jazz or Western literature was now under suspicion. To be a rootless cosmopolitan was a potential death sentence. The friendly, smiling GI was replaced by a new caricature. The American was now a warmonger, a new kind of fascist, rattling his atomic bombs and plotting to enslave the world. The America of Hollywood fantasy was now the source of cultural poison, a decadent rot designed to corrupt the socialist soul. For the ordinary Soviet citizen, this was a terrifying and confusing whiplash. The man they had been told to thank was now the man they were told to hate. And in a totalitarian state, you learn to adapt quickly. You put away your souvenirs from the Elbe. You don't talk about how good the American boots were. You forget the taste of that chocolate bar. The memory of the alliance was driven underground, becoming a private, almost secret history, shared only with trusted family and friends. What then did Soviet people actually think about Americans? They thought they were builders of miracles, masters of metal and machines. They thought they were impossibly rich, living in a world of casual plenty. They thought they were generous, friendly, and a little naive. They thought they were calculating partners who let the Soviet Union do most of the dying. They were grateful for the food that kept them alive and the trucks that helped them win. They were frustrated by the long wait for the Second Front. They were fascinated by their films, their music, their easygoing confidence. And in the end, they were taught to fear and hate them all over again. The story of the Soviet view of Americans during World War II is not one simple truth. It's a collection of truths, often held in the same heart at the same time. It's the story of how grand politics and ideology are filtered through the prism of individual human experience. A soldier doesn't taste a geopolitical strategy, he tastes a can of meat. A driver doesn't feel an alliance, he feels the power of an engine under his foot. The smiles on the Elbe River were real, the gratitude was real, the curiosity was real. And the shared humanity was real. But in the great, tragic sweep of history, that moment was just that, a moment. A brief, hopeful thaw between two long, bitter winters. It's a reminder that even in the midst of the most brutal conflict in history, alliances are complex, perceptions are layered, and the line between a friend and an enemy can be as thin and as easily washed away as a line drawn in the sand on a riverbank in Germany.